What does it take to turn absolute ruin into a global empire? What kind of person can lose a kingdom at 13 only to build a new one 30 years later? This isn't a fairy tale. This is the real-life story of Stanley Ho, a man whose name is etched into the very soul of Macau. Welcome to Fanko Decodes, where we decode the blueprints of legends to build a better version of ourselves. I'm Fanko, your guide on this journey through the lives of the world's most fascinating figures. Stanley Ho, the king of gambling, a name so legendary it borders on mythical. He was a man of contrasts: four-nation mixed heritage, a life spanning 98 years, 4 wives, 17 children, and a fortune measured in the tens of billions. These facts alone made him one of the most talked about and controversial tycoons in the Chinese-speaking world. But what few people know is the raw story behind the glamour. This wasn't a man born into unshakable wealth. He lived a life of dizzying highs and devastating lows, a complete cycle from paradise to hell and back again. At 13, his family dynasty crumbled, forcing him to rely on scholarships to even finish school. At 22, he arrived in Macau with just 10 Hong Kong dollars in his pocket, nearly getting exiled by the local gangs. At 40, he joined forces with a legendary gambler to shatter a 40-year monopoly on Macau's gaming industry. By 60, his empire was so vast it was said he controlled half of Macau's economy, a grip he would maintain for half a century. Today, through the incredible true story of Stanley Ho, we will decode a philosophy of business forged in adversity, defined by choices, and built on relentless persistence. This isn't just the biography of a gambling king. This is a masterclass in how to engineer a comeback when the chips are down. So, without further ado, let's begin today's story. Chapter 1. The Fall of the House of Ho. November 25th, 1921. In the upscale Happy Valley neighborhood of Hong Kong, the cry of a newborn broke the tranquility of a lavish mansion. The child's name was Ho Hung-sun, later known to the world as Stanley Ho. He was born into one of Hong Kong's most powerful and prestigious families. The blood of 4 nations flowed through his veins: Dutch, English, Jewish, and Chinese. In the colonial Hong Kong of that era, such a heritage was the very symbol of aristocracy. The Ho family history was a saga in itself. His great-grandfather, Charles Henry Morris Bosman, was a Dutch Jewish man of British nationality. This young adventurer sailed to Hong Kong in 1858, starting as a humble clerk and eventually rising to prominence in both business and politics. Stanley's granduncle, Sir Robert Ho Tung, was an even more colossal figure in Hong Kong's history. He was the first Chinese person permitted to live in the exclusive Victoria Peak district, a residential area so prestigious that his mansion stood even higher than the governor's. A common saying in Hong Kong at the time was, "Who do you think you are, Ho Tung?" a testament to his immense status. Stanley's grandfather, Ho Fuk, was also one of the 5 great Chinese compradors, a man of immense wealth. By the time Stanley was born, the Ho clan was firmly established as one of Hong Kong's ruling families. His father, Ho Se Kwong, moved effortlessly between the worlds of politics and commerce. His mother came from a distinguished family. They lived a life of unimaginable luxury in their Happy Valley mansion. As a boy, Stanley Ho was the archetypal rich kid. He was chauffeured to school, attended by servants, wore the finest clothes, and ate the most exquisite food. He was enrolled in Hong Kong's top school, Queen's College, an institution founded in 1862 and the city's first public school. But this young prince had a common affliction of the privileged. He had no interest in studying. Stanley was consistently at the bottom of his class, failing subject after subject. After all, with the family's fortune, why bother? Life was for playing. He couldn't possibly have imagined what was waiting for him just around the corner. The year was 1934. Stanley Ho was 13. That year, the Hong Kong stock market was in turmoil. Stanley's father and uncles, acting on a supposedly sure-thing tip from a comprador at a British trading house, borrowed heavily and poured their entire fortune into the market. It was a trap. By the time they realized they'd been played, it was too late. The Ho brothers were wiped out, not only losing their entire family fortune, but also accumulating massive debt. The aftermath was catastrophic. Two of Stanley's uncles took their own lives, one with a gun, the other by hanging. His father, Ho Sai-kwong, fled to Vietnam to escape the creditors, taking only his two eldest sons and leaving his wife and 11 other children behind in Hong Kong. Overnight, Stanley Ho went from a golden child to a social pariah. Creditors swarmed their home, carrying away every last valuable item. Relatives and friends who once fawned over them now pretended not to see them on the street. The servants who had once bowed now looked at them with contempt. Standing in the hollowed-out shell of his home, 13-year-old Stanley experienced for the first time the brutal chill of social status and the cold reality of human nature. This single event fundamentally rewired his worldview. From that moment on, he understood a core truth. In this world, the only thing that truly matters is your own strength. Everything else is fleeting and can vanish in an instant. This searing experience forged the never-say-never character that would define him. He learned in the most painful way possible that when you have nothing, the only path forward is to fight with everything you've got. But the 13-year-old boy didn't know it yet. This catastrophe had destroyed his childhood, but it had also planted the seeds of his future greatness. True strength, as he was about to learn, is always forged in the fires of adversity. Chapter 2: The Prince's Counterattack. After the fall of his house, Stanley Ho faced the first critical choice of his life: to surrender to his fate or to fight back. His mother, her face etched with worry, gently told him, "Son, with our situation, I don't think we can afford your schooling anymore. Perhaps you could find a job to help the family?" At just 13, Stanley looked at his mother's heartbroken expression, a fierce battle raging within him. Getting a job would ease their financial burden, but it would condemn him to a life at the bottom. Continuing his education, though immensely difficult, was his only shot at changing his destiny. "Mother, give me one more chance," Stanley said, his voice filled with a new, unfamiliar determination. "I will win a scholarship." His mother managed a sad smile. "Son, you're at the bottom of your class. Do you really think you can get a scholarship?" "Mother," he replied, "I have to try." Those 4 words changed the course of his life. From that day forward, the carefree, playful boy vanished, replaced by a machine of pure focus. He woke up at 5 a.m. every day and studied late into the night. He employed every ancient Chinese idiom for diligent study, tying his hair to a ceiling beam to keep from dozing off, studying by the light of captured fireflies. He did it all. What makes this feat even more astonishing is where he did it. Stanley was in Class D at Queen's College, a class specifically designed for the school's wealthiest, least motivated students. The school's unspoken policy was, do whatever you want, just don't disturb the other students. Since the school's founding, no student from Class D had ever won a scholarship. But Stanley Ho did. In less than a year, he went from the worst student in his class to the very best, securing the scholarship that would pay for his education. The news sent shockwaves through Queen's College. His teachers couldn't believe it. The spoiled brat who used to sleep through lessons had achieved a miracle. The legend grew. In 1939, at 18, he was admitted to the University of Hong Kong with excellent grades. This university held special significance for his family. His granduncle, Robert Ho Tong, was one of its co-founders, and 7 of his cousins were proud graduates. With his own grit and intellect, Stanley was reclaiming the honor of the Ho family name. But fate, it seemed, was not done with him yet. Just as he entered his 3rd year of university, the Second World War came crashing down on Hong Kong. The British colonial government ordered all university students to cease their studies and join the war effort. Stanley was assigned to the Air Raid Precautions Department as a telephone operator. It was a technical role, and, thankfully, a safe one, far from the front lines. Even better, he was the only male in an office full of female students. A young, handsome man in such an environment might be expected to enjoy the distraction. But Stanley was different. He was preternaturally calm and focused. When female colleagues invited him out, he politely declined. It wasn't that he lacked charm, it was that his mind was fixed on a much larger prize. His post was located in the mansion of his great-uncle, Ho Tong, another wealthy merchant and the half-brother of Robert Ho Tong. Seeing his young grandnephew's drive and ambition, the elder Ho took a liking to him. "Stanley," he asked one day, "have you ever considered going to Macau?" "Why Macau?" Stanley asked. "Because that's where the opportunity is. And during the war, it's relatively safe." Ho Tong explained that Macau was a Portuguese territory. Because Portugal had a large population of Japanese expatriates in Brazil, Japan was hesitant to attack Macau, fearing retaliation against its citizens. This unique political situation had turned Macau into the only neutral safe haven in all of Southeast Asia. Refugees from mainland China, Hong Kong, and across the region were flooding in. Macau's population had exploded, creating a strange, distorted wartime boom. "The place is like a giant construction site right now, full of chances," his great-uncle advised. "I have a friend there who runs a trading company. Why don't you go and try your luck?" In 1943, with a fortune of just 10 Hong Kong dollars in his pocket, 22-year-old Stanley Ho boarded a ferry to Macau alone. Standing on the deck, watching the shores of Hong Kong fade into the distance, his heart was a whirlwind of emotions. 10 years earlier, he was a prince in this city. Now, he was heading to the small, gritty fishing port of Macau to start from nothing. But deep inside him, a fire was burning. It was a fire ignited by a 13-year-old boy in the face of ruin, forged by an 18-year-old scholar in the crucible of intense study, and now carried by a 22-year-old man steeled by adversity. This fire was about to set Macau ablaze and build an empire from its ashes. Stanley Ho didn't know it yet, but he was about to embark on a journey that would define not just his life, but an entire era. As the ferry's horn blared, the young man clenched his fists. He made a promise to himself, "This time I will not fail." Chapter 3. The Macau Hustle. Macau in 1943 was exactly as his great-uncle had described, a chaotic, vibrant, and dangerous place teeming with opportunity. When Stanley Ho stepped off the ferry, the scene was overwhelming. The streets were packed with shops, the entertainment venues were a riot of neon and noise, and the air buzzed with a dozen different languages spoken by refugees and merchants. Compared to the war-torn regions surrounding it, Macau was a different universe. His great-uncle had arranged a job for him at a trading company, a joint venture between Chinese, Portuguese, and Japanese partners. Stanley started at the very bottom, working as both a clerk and a secretary. Here, he immediately showcased his extraordinary talents. First, his gift for languages. In addition to his native Cantonese and fluent English, Stanley threw himself into learning Portuguese and Japanese, essential for dealing with the company's diverse partners. Even more impressive was his memory. One day, his boss took him to a meeting but forgot his address book. As his boss panicked, Stanley calmly said, "Don't worry, sir. I've got it." He proceeded to recite, from memory, the phone number of every client they needed to contact. His boss was stunned. "How do you know all these numbers?" "I memorized the entire Macau phone directory," Stanley replied matter-of-factly. "All 2,000-plus numbers." His boss was speechless. While Macau was a small city, memorizing over 2,000 numbers was an unbelievable feat. Why would you do that? "To be in this business," Stanley said, "you have to be prepared." It was this level of dedication, far beyond the ordinary, that quickly made him a rising star. All three partners at the company admired him and soon offered him a junior partnership. But what truly cemented his reputation was the courage and intelligence he displayed on the company's most dangerous assignments. The firm's main business was risky but lucrative, smuggling surplus goods from neutral Macau into mainland China in exchange for food, which was then brought back to feed the populations of Hong Kong and Macau. The sea routes were treacherous, patrolled by Japanese warships and infested with pirates. Betrayal from within was a constant threat. One wrong move could mean losing everything: the cargo, the ship, and your life. Stanley Ho volunteered for this job. He devised a brilliant strategy. The ship would carry a collection of different flags. Depending on the situation, they would switch them. Leaving Macau's harbor, they flew the Portuguese flag. If they encountered a Japanese warship, they'd hoist the Japanese flag. When they entered Chinese waters, they'd raise the Chinese flag of the time. The first few trips went smoothly, but danger was inevitable. On one mission, they were carrying 300,000 Macanese patakas in cash when an insider betrayed them to pirates. They were surrounded. Just as it seemed all was lost, Stanley remained calm. He waited for the moment the pirates returned to their own boat to divide the loot, then gave the order to cut their losses and make a run for it. But their ordeal wasn't over. On the way back, they were intercepted by a Japanese warship. In the chaos of the pirate attack, all their carefully prepared flags had been lost. Thinking on his feet, Stanley grabbed a white cloth, found some red ink, and quickly painted a makeshift flag that might just fool the Japanese from a distance. He then used his Japanese language skills to engage the soldiers in conversation, spinning a tale that was just convincing enough to get them through. This harrowing experience made Stanley Ho a legend in Macau's business community. This young man from Hong Kong, they whispered, had more than just guts. He had a razor-sharp mind. But an even greater test was yet to come. On another occasion, two of the company's ships were seized by the Japanese, who claimed there were British spies on board. They threatened to confiscate the vessels and execute the crew if the spies weren't handed over. The company's three senior partners were in a state of panic. The ships were immensely valuable. Once again, Stanley Ho stepped up. He volunteered to negotiate directly with the Japanese. This time, the stakes were even higher. He wasn't dealing with low-level soldiers, but with Japanese intelligence officers. He employed a masterful blend of flattery and veiled threats. On one hand, he praised their hard work and suggested that the cargo on the ships was actually war material intended for the Japanese army, so delaying it would be a disservice to the emperor. On the other hand, he subtly hinted that he had powerful connections within the Japanese military command, and if things went wrong, the officers in front of him would be held responsible. Incredibly, they bought it. The ships and crew were released. Final twist? There was a British spy on board, carrying vital military intelligence. After the war, this spy was decorated for his service and went on to become a managing director at several major Macau corporations, becoming another crucial contact in Stanley's growing network. Through this series of life or death trials, the young Stanley Ho accumulated three priceless assets. First, capital. In 1943, his share of the company's profits was a staggering 1 million Hong Kong dollars. At 22, he was a millionaire, a sum most businessmen at the time couldn't earn in a lifetime. Second, experience. By navigating the razor's edge between pirates, spies, and military officers, Stanley learned how to deal with complex power dynamics, how to survive in hostile environments, and most importantly, how to turn an impossible situation into a victory. Third, a network. The British spy he saved, the international merchants he worked with, the Japanese officers he outsmarted, and even the pirate leaders he evaded. They all became part of the human capital he would draw on for the rest of his career. Most importantly, these experiences forged his core philosophy. He would often say later in life, "In my dictionary, the word no does not exist. There is only how." When faced with a difficult problem, you don't say no. You find a way to turn that no into a yes. This wasn't just a clever motto. It was a survival strategy learned in the crucible of real-world danger. When a man has faced down pirates' blades and Japanese interrogators and walked away, what boardroom challenge could possibly intimidate him? By 1945, with the war over, Stanley Ho was firmly established in Macau, but he knew this was just the beginning. A bigger stage, fiercer battles, and a more epic destiny awaited him. He didn't know it yet, but in just over a decade, he would join forces with a legendary gambler named Yip Han, and together they would rewrite the history of Macau. For now, his mission was clear: accumulate power and wait for the perfect moment to strike. A hero's journey is not defined by his origins, but by his strength. Stanley Ho understood this better than anyone. Chapter 4: The Intersection of Love and Opportunity. Macau, 1943. An encounter was about to take place that would alter the trajectory of Stanley Ho's life forever. One evening, Stanley was on a lawn, practicing his Portuguese. It was a habit he had developed after work. He knew that in this international city, another language meant another door opened. Suddenly, he saw a woman walking towards him. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. She moved with an elegance and grace that was utterly captivating. She was, in a word, breathtaking. Her name was Clementina Leitao, known as the most beautiful woman in Macau. Stanley was mesmerized, but he wasn't the type to simply admire from afar. He stood up and walked over to her. Interestingly, he chose to speak in his still broken Portuguese. "Hello, beautiful lady. May I have the pleasure of knowing you?" Clementina was taken aback. The young man was clearly of mixed heritage, but his Portuguese was clumsy. "Are you British?" she asked, intrigued. "Why are you speaking Portuguese to me?" "I'm not British. I'm Chinese from Hong Kong," Stanley answered honestly. "My Portuguese isn't very good. I'm practicing." This reply charmed her. Here was a young man who looked like a foreigner, but proudly identified as Chinese and was working hard to improve himself. "Why do you want to learn Portuguese?" she asked. "Because I want to better understand this city and its culture," Stanley said, a twinkle in his eye. "And I think I would learn much faster with a beautiful teacher." It was a line that was both clever and sincere, expressing his ambition and his admiration for her in a single stroke. Clementina was won over by his frankness and humor. More importantly, in those turbulent times, it was rare to meet a young man with such drive and ambition. They began to see each other. Stanley soon discovered that Clementina was more than just a beautiful face. She came from a prominent Portuguese family. Her ancestors had held high office in the Portuguese government, and her father was a renowned lawyer with deep connections in both Macau and Portugal. Crucially, she was also intelligent, with a sharp mind for business. In 1942, 21-year-old Stanley Ho and Clementina Leitao were married. This marriage was a massive catalyst for Stanley's career. His father-in-law, who greatly admired his new son-in-law, not only made him his part-time secretary but also introduced him into Macau's most influential social circles, giving him access to an invaluable network of contacts. In that moment, Stanley Ho understood that this marriage had brought him far more than love. It was a golden ticket into the heart of Macau's establishment. With Clementina's support, his network and his business ventures expanded rapidly. After the war ended in 1945, Stanley astutely recognized that the economic winds were shifting. Macau's wartime boom was ending, and Hong Kong was poised to reclaim its title as the financial hub of the Far East. He made a decisive move. He would return to Hong Kong to build his next fortune. In 1953, Stanley Ho returned to Hong Kong with over 2 million Hong Kong dollars, a fortune he had built in Macau. The city was in the midst of a golden era of post-war reconstruction. The Korean War had created unique economic demands. A massive influx of refugees provided a huge labor pool, and the British colonial government's pro-business policies all set the stage for a real estate explosion. Stanley Ho seized this opportunity with both hands, investing heavily in property. His strategy was clear and methodical. First, build connections. His time in Macau had taught him a vital lesson. In Chinese society, business success is inextricably linked to government relations. He proactively cultivated relationships with the British colonial administration and soon won lucrative contracts to build housing for the British military garrison in Hong Kong. These were stable, high-profit projects. Throughout the 1950s, Hong Kong's property market soared. Stanley Ho's wealth grew exponentially. In just a few years, his $2 million nest egg had ballooned to $10 million. In today's terms, that would be the equivalent of billions. By now, Stanley Ho was one of Hong Kong's top tycoons. He could have easily settled into the life of a real estate mogul. But destiny had another, more dramatic hand to play. In 1960, a man entered Stanley Ho's life who would change its course forever. His name was Yip Han, and he was the most legendary gambler in Macau. How legendary? Yip Han's specialty was dice. His signature skill was listening to the dice. He could supposedly determine the outcome just by the sound they made as they tumbled, making him nearly unbeatable. His legend was sealed when he single-handedly saved Macau's largest casino from bankruptcy. A rival gang of dice listeners had been cleaning out casinos across the city. When they came for the top dog, casino owner Fu Lo Young's establishment, Yip Han stepped in and, using his superior skills, defeated them, saving the casino. This victory earned him the title, the new king of gambling. But Yip Han's personality was as sharp and unrestrained as his gambling skills. He boasted of his achievements everywhere, openly declaring that his boss, Fu Lo Young, would be nothing without him. This blatant display of outshining his master naturally led to suspicion and resentment, and he was eventually forced out. After failing to make a name for himself in Shanghai, he returned to Hong Kong, but his other business ventures went nowhere. Yip Han was no longer a young man, but he still harbored a burning ambition to reclaim control of Macau's gambling industry. In 1960, his chance arrived. Macau got a new governor who decided to open up the gambling monopoly for public tender, breaking the Fu family's 40-year grip on the industry. Yip Han was ecstatic, but he was missing the most crucial element, money. The bid required a deposit of 700,000 patakas and a massive amount of capital for operations. He couldn't raise it alone. He began searching desperately for partners. It was at this moment that fate brought him to Stanley Ho. The introduction was made by Stanley's brother-in-law, Teddy Yip. Teddy told Yip Han that his wife's brother was a wealthy real estate developer in Hong Kong who also happened to have a Portuguese passport obtained through his marriage to Clementina, which was a key requirement for the bid. In 1961, the two legends finally met. One was a business prodigy who had clawed his way back from ruin. The other was a gambling legend determined to make a final, epic comeback. One had money and connections, but no gambling expertise. The other had skills and experience, but no capital. It was a perfect match. Neither of them could have predicted that this partnership would ignite the most brutal business war in Macau's history and give birth to one of the 20th century's most iconic commercial empires. The story was about to reach its climax. Chapter 5: War on the Macau Waterfront. January 1st, 1962. The New Garden Casino, Macau. The air was thick with the sound of gongs and firecrackers, but beneath the celebration, a palpable tension simmered. This was no ordinary grand opening. It was the declaration of a war for survival. 6 months earlier, the alliance of Stanley Ho, Yip Han, Henry Fok, and Teddy Yip had done the unthinkable. They had defeated the Fu family, who had held the Macau gambling monopoly for 40 years, and won the new gaming concession. But winning the license was just the opening shot. The real war was about to begin. The sons of the defeated patriarch Fulo Yong were not going to surrender their empire quietly. They allied with Macau's most powerful triad boss, Big Brother Shu, and declared all-out war on the new concessionaires. Who was Shu? A former captain in the Nationalist Army, his men were professionally trained soldiers armed with modern weapons. In Macau, even the government treated him with deference. They issued Stanley Ho an ultimatum, a list of threats that became infamously known as the 8 Articles. 1. We will take Stanley Ho's life. 2. We will force every hotel in Macau to close, leaving Hong Kong gamblers with nowhere to stay. 3. We will shut down all ferry services between Hong Kong and Macau, cutting off the flow of customers. 4. We will pay the Beggars Syndicate to block the entrance to your casino. 5. We will ensure no one dares to rent you any viable location for a casino. 6. We will buy off all your experienced staff, leaving you with no one to run the games. 7. We will throw hand grenades into your casino. 8. We will use our government connections to make sure your contract is never finalized. Reading this list, even the seasoned tycoon Henry Falk felt a chill of fear. He urged Stanley to back down. "There's no end to making money," he pleaded. "It's not worth risking your life." At that moment, Stanley Ho stood at another crossroads. Falk's fears were justified. Their enemy was a ruthless gang of armed thugs. In the dead of night, he admitted to himself a flicker of doubt. He remembered being 13, watching his father flee and his family shatter. He knew, with absolute certainty, that to retreat now would be to repeat that history, to be crushed under someone else's heel once more. That flicker of doubt was extinguished, replaced by a steely resolve. He turned to Henry Falk and said, "I cannot have the word no in my life. They already forced me out once. It will not happen a second time." He followed this with a gritty Cantonese phrase, drying peppercorns on the neighbor's doorstep. The raw meaning was simple: bring it on. Stanley Ho had decided to meet the underworld head-on, without compromise. As he later said, "I cannot have the word no in my life. I was already forced out once. A second time is impossible." But how would he counter Shu's 8 articles? Article 1. The threat on his life. Ho's response: he took out a public notice. "If I am assassinated," the notice read, "my lawyer will pay a $1 million reward to whoever brings the killer to justice within 48 hours. Article 2. Closing the hotels. Ho's response: he went directly to the Macau government and persuaded them to lease him government-owned properties, solving the accommodation crisis. Article 3. Shutting down the ferries. Ho's response: this tactic might have worked on others, but not on him. He already owned shares in a ferry company. He called a board meeting, rallied support from other directors, and resumed the service. Then he invested heavily in new ships, turning the transport business into a thriving enterprise. Articles 4 to 6, blockades, supply cuts, and staff poaching. Ho's response: he sent Yip Han, a man who knew the city's underbelly, to break their opponent's strategy. Yip Han told the staff they had bought off, "They can pay you for a few months. I can give you a job for decades, even a pension." He also found the leader of the Beggars Syndicate and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Article 7, the hand grenades. Ho's response: this was the most direct threat, and Shu's men actually did throw grenades at Ho's properties. Ho's counter was even more audacious. He got military police protection, and then he acquired a crate of hand grenades from his own military sources. He placed them at the entrance of his casino with a clear message: "For every grenade you throw at me, I will return a crate." He also put out a bounty, $10,000 for anyone who throws one of these at their headquarters for me. Article 8, the government contract. Ho's response: this was the most dangerous threat. The official contract was indeed being held up by bureaucratic problems. Stanley Ho flew to Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, 3 times. He used every connection he had, from his wife's family to his business network, to lobby the highest levels of the Portuguese government. His efforts paid off. On March 30, 1962, the new governor of Macau, Antonio de Lemos, officially signed the contract with him. With this series of strategic counterpunches, Stanley Ho systematically dismantled the 8 articles. But the most masterful part of his plan was yet to come. In May 1962, the Sociedad de Turismo y Diversos de Macau, STDM, was officially formed. Teddy Yip was the chairman, with Yip Han, Henry Fok, and Stanley Ho as managing directors. On paper, the 4 were equals, but behind the scenes, Stanley Ho began to consolidate his power. First, he controlled the capital. While the 4 partners theoretically had equal shares, only Ho had put up a significant amount of his own money. The others had contributed their expertise or connections. Next, through his sister Winnie Ho, he brought in a $2 million investment from the powerful Ho Tung clan, upsetting the delicate balance of power among the 4 founders. He then initiated 2 more rounds of capital increases, further diluting the shares of Yip Han and the others. Simultaneously, outside of the main casino company, Ho established the Shun Tak Group, which took control of all the lucrative auxiliary businesses, the ferry services, hotels, and real estate. By the early 1970s, Stanley Ho controlled everything around the casinos. The only piece of the empire still in Yip Han's hands was the casino floor itself. But Yip Han had a fatal flaw. He was a specialist. A genius of the gaming table, Yip Han knew nothing of modern corporate management or capital markets. He believed that controlling the casino meant controlling the company, blind to the fact that the real power had already shifted. In 1973, Yip Han took a trip to Europe. While he was away, Stanley Ho staged his corporate coup. He completely restructured the casino management, removing all of Yip Han's loyalists from key positions and replacing them with a new generation of young, ambitious managers loyal only to him. When Yip Han returned, he found himself completely powerless. Furious, he confronted Ho. "You're kicking me out after I helped you build this." Stanley Ho's reply was cold and pragmatic. "Brother Han, times have changed. A modern enterprise needs modern management, not old-school street loyalty." In 1975, Yip Han officially retired. He asked for his son to take over his role, but Ho refused. From that point on, Stanley Ho was the undisputed king of Macau's gaming world. But Yip Han was not a man to give up. When the STDM contract was up for renewal in 1975, he allied with jewelry tycoon Cheng Yutong to try and win back the concession. Stanley Ho's response was surgical. He went directly to Cheng Yutong and offered him the rights to operate a lucrative VIP gambling hall within his casino. Cheng accepted, and Yip Han's alliance crumbled. Yip Han was defeated again. Still, he refused to fade away. In the 1980s, at the age of 84, he spent 7.5 million Hong Kong dollars to buy and convert a passenger ship into a floating casino, the Oriental Princess, which he anchored in international waters to compete with Ho. This move was surprisingly effective. Operating in international waters meant he was free from Macau's regulations and taxes. The Oriental Princess quickly siphoned off 25% of the Macau casino's business. At first, Stanley Ho was furious, publicly condemning the venture. But as he watched his profits bleed, he had no choice but to follow suit, converting his own ships into floating casinos. Seeing this, the 85-year-old Yip Han laughed, sold the Oriental Princess, and walked away with a final, triumphant gesture. He had forced the king to play his game. In 1997, Yip Han passed away at the age of 92. Stanley Ho attended the funeral personally. The tribute he sent was inscribed with 4 Chinese characters, Gao Shan Yangzi. It translates to beholding a great mountain. It was a sign of respect from one titan to another. Though they had battled for a lifetime, Ho always acknowledged that without Yip Han, his empire would never have existed. After this final war, Stanley Ho's reign as the king of gambling was absolute. But his ambition was far from satisfied. His next goal was to build a true empire, one that spanned not just gambling, but but shipping, real estate, and hospitality. The legend was still growing. Chapter 6: The Empire's Zenith and the Succession War. By the 1980s, Stanley Ho was at the pinnacle of his power. He was no longer just the master of Macau's casinos. He was the architect of a sprawling commercial empire. STDM controlled the gaming industry. Shintak Holdings monopolized transport between Hong Kong and Macau. His other ventures spanned real estate, electronics, and more. It was estimated that during this decade, Stanley Ho's enterprises accounted for nearly half of Macau's entire economy. But what truly cemented his legacy was not just his business acumen, but the critical choices he made during a period of immense historical change. In 1984, the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed, sealing Hong Kong's return to China. In 1987, a similar agreement was signed for Macau. For Stanley Ho, this was both a monumental opportunity and an existential threat. The opportunity was clear. With the backing of mainland China, Macau's potential market was limitless. The threat was equally stark. Would the communist government in Beijing allow gambling, a capitalist vice, to continue? If not, his entire empire could collapse overnight. Faced with this uncertainty, many Hong Kong and Macau businessmen chose to move their assets abroad. Ho, too, explored this option, making investments overseas throughout the 80s and 90s. But most of these ventures failed, teaching him a crucial lesson. His true foundation, his true strength, lay in China. 1999 marked a pivotal turning point. As Macau prepared for its return to Chinese sovereignty, the 40-year gambling monopoly that Ho had fought so hard to win and maintain was about to be broken. The prevailing opinion was that the new government should open the market to competition. Adding to Ho's anxiety, his old partner, Henry Fok, publicly supported this view, arguing that the monopoly had allowed triad influence to flourish, damaging Macau's reputation. During this period, Stanley Ho was consumed by worry. In the end, however, Beijing and the new Macau SAR government offered him an elegant solution. In 2002, the gaming monopoly was officially ended. The market was opened up to new bidders, and the single concession was split into 3, which later became 6 through sub-concessions. The Ho family managed to secure 3 of these licenses, remaining the single largest player in the new competitive market. This outcome was a masterstroke of political compromise. It broke the monopoly and introduced foreign investment while still honoring Ho's historical contributions. The post-handover era ushered in an unprecedented boom for Macau. In 2003, mainland China opened up individual travel to Hong Kong and Macau. By 2004, Macau's GDP had surpassed Hong Kong's, and in 2006, Macau's gaming revenue overtook that of Las Vegas, making it the undisputed gambling capital of the world. Stanley Ho's fortune soared, making him one of the wealthiest men in Asia. But as he entered his final years, his focus shifted from accumulating wealth to a far more complex challenge, securing the future of his family and his empire. With 4 wives and 17 children, Stanley Ho's family life was a saga in itself. The battle for his succession would prove to be his last and most dramatic war. In 2009, at the age of 88, Stanley Ho suffered a serious fall at the home of his 4th wife, Angela Leong. His health declined sharply thereafter. This event triggered the start of a long, complex, and often public process of transferring his assets to his wives and children. The ensuing power struggle was intense, with different branches of the family fighting for control, their disputes spilling into the courtroom. The final arrangement saw the children from his 2nd wife, Lucina Lom, emerge with the lion's share of the core assets. Pansy Ho took control of Shintak Holdings, becoming the queen of shipping. Daisy Ho became the head of SJM Holdings, inheriting the flagship casino business. Lawrence Ho continued to run his own successful gaming empire, Melco International. 4th wife, Angela Leong, remained a co-chairman of SJM. Asterisk third wife, Ina Chan, was given a position as an executive director. This outcome was a reflection of both Stanley Ho's careful planning and the sheer competence of his second family's children, who were widely regarded as the most capable and business-savvy of his offspring. But the family drama left deep scars. The most tragic was the complete breakdown of his relationship with his younger sister, Winnie Ho. Winnie had been a crucial partner in the early days, instrumental in establishing the casino empire. But they had a bitter falling out over shares and family politics, leading to a series of lawsuits that began in 2001. They never reconciled. When Winnie passed away in 2018, the legal battles were still ongoing. She even wrote a book titled Fighting the Devil, a scathing critique of her brother. Her reported last words were a demand for him to return the money. This feud cast a tragic shadow over Stanley Ho's legacy. In his later years, when asked about his sister, he would simply remain silent, a flicker of sadness in his eyes that even his immense success could not erase. The victory in the boardroom could never compensate for the loss of family. It was, perhaps, the one debt the king of gambling could never repay. The philosophy of Stanley Ho. Looking back at his extraordinary 98-year journey, we can decode a distinct life philosophy. 1. Never say impossible. From the ashes of his family's ruin at 13 to becoming the king of Macau, Stanley Ho's life was a testament to turning the impossible into the inevitable. His famous motto wasn't just a saying, it was his operating system. My dictionary doesn't have the word no, only how. Find a way to turn no into yes. 2. Seize the tides of history. Asterisk. He had an uncanny ability to read the currents of his time and position himself to ride the wave. The unique safe haven status of wartime Macau, the post-war real estate boom in Hong Kong, the opening of the Macau gaming monopoly, and China's economic rise. He capitalized on every major historical shift. 3. Master the game of people and power. Asterisk. Stanley Ho's greatest skill wasn't at the baccarat table. It was his profound understanding of human nature and politics. He knew when to partner, when to fight, when to compromise, and when to stand firm. He played the long game, always thinking several moves ahead. 4. Legacy over personal gain. Asterisk. While his final years were marked by family conflict, his ultimate goal was to ensure the continuation of the dynasty he had built. He cultivated a generation of successors who, despite their rivalries, were capable of steering his empire into the future. On May 26, 2020, at the age of 98, Stanley Ho passed away peacefully. His life spanned a century of dramatic change, witnessing virtually every major event in modern Chinese history. From the last days of the Qing dynasty to the World Wars, from China's opening up to the handover of Hong Kong and Macau, he was not merely a spectator of history, he was an active participant and a creator of it. He proved with his life that a hero is defined not by his birth, but by his strength. Circumstances may create heroes, but heroes can also create their circumstances. And while success requires timing, luck, and connections, the most crucial ingredient is the unwavering will to persist. After his death, the Macau government lowered its flags to half-mast in his honor. The boy who had lost everything had become a symbol of his era. His tombstone does not bear the title King of Gambling. It reads Patriot and Businessman Stanley Ho. Perhaps this is the most fitting summary of his life. He was a capitalist who built fortunes, but also a patriot who contributed to his nation. He was a legend of an era and also the end of one. Stanley Ho's story teaches us that true success isn't measured by the money you make, but by finding your place in the grand sweep of history and holding on until the very end. Fanko Decodes, your blueprint. So, what can we decode from the life of Stanley Ho for our own journey? First, the bottom is a solid foundation. The family crisis at 13 wasn't the end. It was the beginning of his true education. True strength is not the absence of adversity, but the refusal to be defeated by it. This is what we call a high adversity quotient. Second, your skills are more valuable than your inheritance. Though born into a great house, Stanley's empire was built on his own sweat and intellect. From memorizing 2,000 phone numbers to outwitting pirates, every victory was earned. Third, your ability to see opportunities determines your altitude. From the chaos of wartime Macau to the dawn of a new China, Stanley possessed a rare vision. He didn't just see the world as it was, he saw it as it could be. Fourth, flexibility beats rigidity. Ho's greatest genius was his ability to turn no into yes. Faced with gangsters, he didn't just fight, he outmaneuvered them. Faced with political change, he didn't flee, he adapted. Fifth, what you leave behind is more than what you own. In the end, Stanley Ho's greatest legacy is not his billions, but the spirit he embodied, the tenacity to never surrender, the wisdom to adapt, and a deep-seated connection to his homeland. His life was a real-world epic, a masterclass in business, and a profound lesson in what it means to be human. In our own rapidly changing world, we all face our own challenges and crises. Stanley Ho's story is a powerful reminder. True strength isn't about never falling, it's about getting back up every single time. True wisdom isn't about avoiding risk, it's about finding opportunity within it. True success isn't about what you acquire, it's about who you become. Now, I want to ask you a few questions for your own life's ledger. When you hit rock bottom, do you curse your fate, or do you search for a crack of light? When you face a powerful opponent, do you run, or do you find a smarter way to fight? And Stanley Ho's life was a high-stakes gamble. What's the biggest gamble you've ever taken on yourself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you see him as a hero, a ruthless tycoon, or something in between? And what was more crucial to his success, his personal ability, or the unique era he lived in? Remember his life's motto, "My dictionary doesn't have the word no, only how." May you, in the great game of your own life, become a winner not by luck, but by your wisdom and your will. Because the biggest bet you'll ever make is on yourself. I'm Fanko, and this has been another Decode. If you found value in this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Remember, the most important story to understand is your own. Until next time, keep decoding.